The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden glow over the small town. The streets were quiet, except for the occasional chirping of birds and the distant hum of a car engine. A police officer, in his late 30s, sat in his patrol car, sipping coffee from a thermos. He had been on duty since midnight, and the early morning hours were always the hardest. His eyes were tired, but his mind was sharp. He had made a promise he intended to keep, no matter how long it took. The officer had grown up in this town. He knew every street, every corner, and almost every face. But there was one face he hadn't seen in years, a face that haunted him in his dreams. It was the face of a little boy, no older than 6, with wide, innocent eyes and a smile that could light up a room. The boy was his younger brother, who had gone missing over a decade ago. The officer had joined the police force for one reason: to find his brother. He had been just a teenager when his brother disappeared, and the pain of that loss had never left him. His parents had searched tirelessly, but as the years went by, hope began to fade. The officer, however, refused to give up. He had made a promise to his mother on her deathbed, a promise to bring her son home. As he drove through the empty streets, his mind wandered back to that fateful day. It had been a warm summer afternoon. His brother had been playing in the front yard while he was inside, doing homework. When he went out to call him for lunch, his brother was gone. At first, he thought he had wandered off to a neighbor's house, but as the hours passed, panic set in. The police were called, and a search began, but no trace of the boy was ever found. The officer shook his head, trying to push the memories away. He had spent years searching for clues, following leads, and chasing shadows. But every time he thought he was close, the trail would go cold. It was frustrating, but he couldn't give up. He owed it to his brother, to his mother, and to himself. As he turned onto Main Street, his radio crackled to life. It was dispatch, reporting a disturbance at a local park. The officer sighed, put his thermos down, and turned on his siren. Duty called, and he couldn't ignore it. But as he sped toward the park, his mind was still on his brother. The park was empty when he arrived, except for a group of teenagers sitting on a bench. They looked up as he approached, their faces a mix of guilt and defiance. The officer recognized one of them, a boy who had been in trouble before. He sighed and began to talk to them, his tone firm but kind. He knew what it was like to be young and restless, and he tried to guide them rather than scare them. As he was wrapping up, one of the boys looked at him and said, "You're that cop, aren't you? The one who's always looking for his brother." The officer froze. He wasn't used to people bringing it up, especially not kids. He nodded slowly, and the boy continued, "My mom says you'll never find him. That it's been too long." The officer's heart ached, but he forced a smile. "Maybe she's right," he said. "But I made a promise. And I'm not the kind of man who breaks his promises." The boys nodded, their expressions softening. They didn't say anything else, but the officer could see the respect in their eyes. As he walked back to his car, he felt a renewed sense of determination. He didn't know if he would ever find his brother, but he knew he had to keep trying. The rest of his shift passed uneventfully. He patrolled the streets, helped an elderly woman cross the road, and even stopped to pet a stray dog. But his mind was never far from his brother. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, he finally headed home, exhausted but resolute. His apartment was small and sparsely furnished. The walls were bare, except for a single photo of his family, taken before his brother disappeared. He looked at it every day, reminding himself of what he had lost, and what he was fighting for. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he thought about the boy at the park. The boy's words had stung, but they had also reminded him of something important: he wasn't just searching for his brother. He was searching for hope, for closure, and for a way to honor the promise he had made. The officer closed his eyes, letting the weight of the day settle over him. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one thing for certain: he would never stop looking. The next morning, the officer woke up to the sound of his alarm clock buzzing loudly on the nightstand. He groaned, rubbing his eyes as he reached over to silence it. The sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, casting a warm glow across the room. He sat up slowly, his body still heavy with exhaustion. Sleep had been elusive, as it often was when his mind was consumed by thoughts of his brother. After a quick shower and a cup of coffee, he dressed in his uniform and headed out the door. The town was already coming to life, with people bustling about their morning routines. He waved at a few familiar faces as he walked to his patrol car, but his mind was elsewhere. The conversation with the boy at the park the previous day had stirred something in him, a renewed sense of urgency. As he drove through the town, he decided to take a detour. There was a place he hadn't visited in a while, a place that held both painful memories and a faint glimmer of hope. It was an old playground on the outskirts of town, near the woods where his brother had last been seen. The playground had been abandoned for years, its swings rusted and its slide cracked. But to the officer, it was a place where time stood still. When he arrived, he parked his car and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. The air was crisp, and the sound of leaves rustling in the wind filled the silence. He walked slowly toward the playground, his heart heavy with emotion. This was where it had all begun, where his brother had vanished without a trace. He sat on one of the broken swings, the chains creaking under his weight. Closing his eyes, he let the memories flood back. He could almost hear his brother's laughter, see him running around the playground with boundless energy. Those were the happiest days of his life, and they had been ripped away in an instant. As he sat there, lost in thought, a sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, but as he listened closely, he realized it was the sound of someone crying. He stood up quickly, his instincts kicking in. Following the sound, he walked toward the edge of the woods, where the trees grew thick and the shadows deepened. There, sitting on a fallen log, was a young girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, her face streaked with tears. She looked up as he approached, her eyes wide with fear. "Hey, it's okay," the officer said softly, crouching down to her level. "I'm a police officer. Are you hurt?" The girl shook her head, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. I got lost," she stammered. "I was playing with my friends, and then I couldn't find them." The officer's heart ached for her. He knew all too well the fear of being lost and alone. "Don't worry," he said gently. "I'll help you find your friends." "What's your name?" "Lily," the girl whispered. "Okay, Lily. Let's get you back to your family, all right?" He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. As they walked back toward the playground, the officer couldn't help but think of his brother. He wondered if someone had found him that day, if someone had helped him when he was scared and alone. The thought brought a lump to his throat, but he pushed it aside. Right now, he had to focus on Lily. He radioed dispatch, giving them a description of the girl and asking if anyone had reported a missing child. Within minutes, they received a call from a frantic mother who had been searching for her daughter. The officer brought Lily to the station, where her mother was waiting, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," the woman said, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. "Thank you so much." The officer nodded, a small smile on his face. "It's my job," he said simply. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was his way of honoring his brother, of making sure no other family had to endure the pain his had suffered. As the day went on, the officer couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Finding Lily had reminded him of why he had become a police officer in the first place. It wasn't just about solving crimes or keeping the peace, it was about helping people, about being there when they needed him most. That evening, as he sat in his apartment, he pulled out an old notebook. It was filled with notes and sketches, everything he had gathered over the years about his brother's disappearance. He flipped through the pages, his eyes lingering on a map of the town with certain areas circled in red. These were the places he had searched, the places where he had found nothing but dead ends. But now, as he looked at the map, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe he had been looking in the wrong places. Maybe the answers were closer than he thought. He grabbed a pen and began to write, jotting down new ideas and possibilities. He didn't know where this would lead, but he knew he had to try. For his brother, for his mother, and for himself. As he closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair, he felt a sense of determination wash over him. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it, no matter what it took. The next few days passed in a blur of routine and reflection. The officer continued his patrols, responded to calls, and helped the people of his town, but his mind was never far from the notebook sitting on his desk at home. Each night, he would return to it, adding new thoughts and revisiting old leads. The encounter with Lily had reignited something in him, a sense of purpose that had been dulled by years of disappointment. One evening, as he was finishing his shift, he received a call from an old friend. It was someone he had grown up with, someone who had been there when his brother disappeared. The friend, now a teacher at the local school, had heard about the officer's ongoing search and wanted to help. "I've been thinking," the friend said over the phone. "There's someone you should talk to. An old man who lives near the edge of town. He's been around forever, and he knows more about this place than anyone. If there's anyone who might have seen something that day, it's him." The officer thanked his friend and hung up, his heart racing. It was a long shot, but it was something. He had learned over the years that even the smallest lead could sometimes lead to the biggest breakthroughs. The next morning, he drove to the edge of town, where the houses were few and far between. The old man's home was a small, weathered cottage surrounded by overgrown trees and a rusty fence. The officer parked his car and walked up the creaky porch steps, knocking gently on the door. After a moment, the door opened, revealing a frail man with a long white beard and kind eyes. He looked at the officer with a mixture of curiosity and recognition. "Can I help you?" the old man asked, his voice soft but steady. The officer introduced himself and explained why he was there. As he spoke, the old man's expression grew serious. He invited the officer inside, offering him a seat at a small wooden table. "I remember that day," the old man said after a long pause. "It was a hot summer afternoon, just like any other. But something felt off. I can't explain it, but I've never forgotten it." The officer leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Did you see anything? Anything at all that might help me find my brother?" The old man hesitated, his eyes distant. "I didn't see much," he said slowly. "But I remember a car. It was parked near the playground, and I didn't recognize it. It wasn't from around here. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think much of it at the time." The officer's mind raced. A car. It was a detail he hadn't heard before. "Do you remember what it looked like?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. The old man nodded. "It was an old sedan, dark blue or black. The paint was faded, and there was a dent on the side. I didn't see the driver, but I remember thinking it was odd that it was there for so long." The officer thanked the old man, his mind buzzing with possibilities. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He spent the rest of the day driving around town, asking people if they remembered seeing a car like that on the day his brother disappeared. Most people shook their heads, but a few recalled something similar. As the sun began to set, he found himself back at the playground, the place where it had all begun. He sat on the same broken swing, staring out at the woods. The old man's words echoed in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was closer than ever to finding the truth. That night, he returned to his notebook, adding the new information about the car. He sketched a rough outline of what it might have looked like: based on the descriptions he had gathered. As he worked, he felt a sense of hope that he hadn't felt in years. The next morning, he decided to visit the local library. It was a long shot, but he wanted to see if there were any records of cars matching the description in the area around the time his brother disappeared. The librarian, an elderly woman with a kind smile, helped him search through old newspapers and police reports. Hours passed, and just as he was about to give up, he found something. It was a small article in a newspaper from a neighboring town, reporting a suspicious vehicle seen near a park. The description matched the one the old man had given him. The officer's hands trembled as he read the article. It was dated just a few days after his brother's disappearance. Could it be connected? He didn't know, but it was the closest he had come to a real lead in years. He copied the information and left the library, his mind racing. He knew he had to follow this lead, no matter where it took him. But as he walked back to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of something big, something that could change everything. That evening, he sat in his apartment, staring at the map on his wall. He marked the location mentioned in the article, his hand steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew he had to keep going. For his brother. For his mother. For the promise he had made. The officer spent the next few days piecing together everything he had learned. The dark blue or black sedan with the dent on the side was now the center of his investigation. He reached out to neighboring towns, asking if anyone remembered seeing a car like that around the time his brother disappeared. He even contacted the police department in the town where the newspaper article had been published, hoping they might have more information. The response was slow, and many leads turned out to be dead ends. But the officer didn't give up. He had come too far to stop now. Every night, he would sit at his desk, poring over maps, notes, and old photographs, trying to find a connection he might have missed. One evening, as he was about to call it a night, his phone rang. It was a detective from the neighboring town, someone he had spoken to earlier in the week. "I think I might have something for you," the detective said. "We had a case around that time involving a stolen car. The description matches the one you gave me, dark blue sedan, dent on the side. The car was found abandoned a few days later, but we never caught the driver." The officer's heart raced. "Do you have any records from that case? Anything that might help me?" "I'll dig through the files and see what I can find," the detective replied. "But it's been a long time. Don't get your hopes up." The officer thanked him and hung up, his mind spinning. A stolen car. It made sense. If someone had taken his brother, they wouldn't have used their own vehicle. They would have used something untraceable. The next morning, he drove to the neighboring town to meet the detective in person. The police station was small and cramped, with stacks of files lining the walls. The detective, a middle-aged man with a tired but kind face, greeted him and led him to a cluttered desk. "Here's what I found," the detective said, handing him a thin file. "It's not much, but it's something." The officer opened the file and began to read. There were photos of the abandoned car, notes from the investigation, and a list of items found inside. Most of it was useless: old fast food wrappers, a broken radio, and a few empty bottles. But one thing caught his eye: a child's toy. It was a small action figure, the kind his brother used to love. The officer's hands trembled as he held the photo. Could it be his brother's? It was impossible to say for sure, but it was the first tangible link he had found in years. "Do you know where the car was found?" the officer asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The detective nodded. "It was in a field about 10 miles outside of town. The area was pretty remote, so we didn't get many leads. Whoever left it there knew what they were doing." The officer thanked the detective and left the station, his mind racing. He knew he had to visit the field where the car had been found. It was a long shot, but he had to see it for himself. The drive took about an hour, and the road grew narrower and more desolate as he went. When he finally arrived, he parked his car and stepped out, the tall grass swaying in the breeze. The field was vast and empty, with no signs of life except for a few birds circling overhead. He walked slowly, scanning the ground for anything that might catch his eye. It had been years since the car was found, and the area had likely been picked clean by investigators. But he had to try. As he walked, his mind wandered back to his brother. He thought about the day he disappeared, the sound of his laughter, the way he would run around the playground with endless energy. He thought about the promise he had made to his mother, the promise he was determined to keep. After what felt like hours, he found something. It was small and partially buried in the dirt, but it glinted in the sunlight. He knelt down and brushed the dirt away, revealing a small metal charm. It was shaped like a star, the kind that might have been attached to a bracelet or necklace. The officer held it in his hand, his heart pounding. It could have belonged to anyone, but something about it felt significant. He didn't know why, but he felt like he was getting closer. As the sun began to set, he returned to his car, the charm clutched tightly in his hand. He didn't know what it meant, but it was another piece of the puzzle. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like the pieces were starting to come together. That night, he sat at his desk, staring at the charm. He didn't know where it would lead him, but he knew he had to keep going. For his brother. For his mother. For the promise he had made. The small metal charm became the officer's new focus. He spent hours researching its design, trying to determine where it might have come from. It was a long shot, but he had learned over the years that even the smallest details could lead to big breakthroughs. He visited local jewelry stores, antique shops, and even pawn shops, showing the charm to anyone who might recognize it. Most people shook their heads, unable to help. But one day, as he was about to give up, an elderly woman at a small thrift store paused and studied the charm closely. "I've seen something like this before," she said, her voice soft and thoughtful. "It's not exactly the same, but it's similar. There's a craftsman who lives a few towns over. He makes handmade jewelry, and I remember he used to use charms like this in his designs. His name is, let me think, oh, yes, Mr. Harris." The officer's heart leapt. It was the first real lead he had gotten in weeks. He thanked the woman and hurried back to his car, determined to find this Mr. Harris. The drive to the next town took about an hour. The officer used the time to think about what he would say, how he would explain why he was there. He didn't know if Mr. Harris would remember anything, but he had to try. When he arrived, he found the craftsman's shop tucked away on a quiet street. The sign above the door read, "Harris Handmade Jewelry," and the window was filled with delicate pieces of silver and gold. The officer took a deep breath and stepped inside. The shop was small but cozy, with shelves lined with jewelry and tools scattered across a workbench. A man in his late 60s stood behind the counter, his hands busy with a pair of pliers. He looked up as the officer entered, his eyes curious but kind. "Can I help you?" the man asked, setting down his tools. The officer introduced himself and explained why he was there. He showed Mr. Harris the charm, watching closely for any sign of recognition. The craftsman took the charm and studied it carefully, turning it over in his hands. After a moment, he nodded. "Yes, I've made charms like this before. They were popular years ago, especially with children. I used to sell them at fairs and markets." The officer's heart raced. "Do you remember who might have bought one? Or where they might have ended up?" Mr. Harris frowned, thinking. "It's hard to say. I sold so many of them over the years." But, he paused, his eyes narrowing. "There was one time, about 10 or 12 years ago, when a man came in and bought a handful of these charms. He said they were for his daughter, but something about him seemed off. I don't know why, but I've never forgotten it." The officer leaned forward, his pulse quickening. Do you remember what he looked like? Or anything else about him? Mr. Harris nodded slowly. He was tall, with dark hair and a scar above his eyebrow. He didn't say much, just paid and left. But I remember thinking he didn't seem like the type to buy children's jewelry. The officer thanked Mr. Harris and left the shop, his mind racing. A tall man with dark hair and a scar above his eyebrow. It wasn't much, but it was more than he had before. He spent the next few days searching through old police records, looking for anyone matching that description. It was tedious work, but he didn't mind. He was used to long hours and dead ends. Finally, he found something. It was a report from about 12 years ago, detailing the arrest of a man named Victor Grayson. He was a drifter with a history of petty crimes, and he matched the description Mr. Harris had given. The report mentioned a scar above his eyebrow and noted that he had been seen driving a dark blue sedan around the time of his arrest. The officer's hands trembled as he read the report. Could this be the man who had taken his brother? He didn't know, but it was the closest he had come to an answer in years. He tracked down Victor Grayson's last known address, an old trailer park on the outskirts of a nearby city. The place was run down and abandoned, with weeds growing through the cracks in the pavement. The officer walked slowly through the park, his heart pounding in his chest. He found the trailer listed in the records, its windows broken and its door hanging open. He stepped inside, the air thick with dust and decay. The place had been empty for years, but he searched every corner, hoping to find something, anything, that might lead him to his brother. In the back room, he found a small box tucked under the bed. Inside were a few old photographs, a handful of coins, and a child's bracelet with a star-shaped charm attached. The officer's breath caught in his throat. It was the same charm he had found in the field. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew he was closer than ever to finding the truth. The officer sat in his car outside the abandoned trailer park, clutching the child's bracelet in his hand. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, hope, fear, anger, and determination. The discovery of the bracelet felt like a breakthrough, but it also raised more questions than answers. Who was Victor Grayson? Where was he now? And most importantly, what had happened to his brother? He knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed help. Returning to the station, he approached his captain, a seasoned officer who had been with the department for decades. The captain listened carefully as the officer explained everything, the charm, the bracelet, Victor Grayson, and the connection to his brother's disappearance. "This is big," the captain said, leaning back in his chair. "But it's also a cold case. We'll need solid evidence to reopen it. Do you have anything else?" The officer hesitated. He didn't have much, but he had enough to keep going. "I know it's a long shot," he said, "but I can't let this go. Not now. Not when I'm this close." The captain studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. I'll see what I can do. But you need to be careful. If this Victor Grayson is involved, he could be dangerous." The officer thanked him and left the station, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He spent the next few days working with the department to track down Victor Grayson. They discovered that Grayson had a criminal record spanning several states, with charges ranging from theft to assault. He had been in and out of prison for years, but his current whereabouts were unknown. The officer didn't give up. He contacted law enforcement agencies in other states, sharing Grayson's description and asking for any information. He also reached out to old contacts, including the detective from the neighboring town who had helped him earlier. One evening, as he was going through old case files, his phone rang. It was the detective. "I think I've got something," the detective said. Victor Grayson was spotted a few months ago in a small town about 3 hours from here. He was working odd jobs and staying at a motel. "I've got the address." The officer's heart raced. This was it. He thanked the detective and hung up, his hands trembling with anticipation. He knew he had to act quickly. The next morning, he drove to the small town, his mind focused on the task ahead. The motel was a rundown place on the edge of town, with flickering neon lights and cracked pavement. The officer parked his car and approached the front desk, showing the clerk a photo of Victor Grayson. "Have you seen this man?" he asked. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, nodded. "Yeah, he stayed here for a while. Room 12. But he left a few weeks ago. Didn't say where he was going." The officer's heart sank, but he pressed on. "Do you know anything else about him? Did he talk to anyone? Have any visitors?" The clerk shrugged. "Not really. He kept to himself. But I remember he used to hang out at the diner down the street. Maybe someone there knows more." The officer thanked her and headed to the diner, a small, cozy place with checkered floors and a jukebox in the corner. He showed Grayson's photo to the waitress, who recognized him immediately. "Yeah, he came in here a lot," she said. "Always sat in the same booth and ordered the same thing, coffee and a slice of pie. He didn't talk much, but he seemed nervous, like he was waiting for someone." The officer's pulse quickened. Did anyone ever meet him here? Or did he mention anything about his plans? The waitress thought for a moment. "There was one time," she said slowly. "A man came in and sat with him. They talked for a while, then left together. I didn't see where they went." The officer's mind raced. Could this man be connected to his brother's disappearance? He asked the waitress if she remembered what the man looked like, but her description was vague: average height, brown hair, nothing distinctive. Feeling frustrated but determined, the officer decided to stake out the diner. He spent the next few days sitting in his car, watching the comings and goings of the patrons. It was tedious work, but he didn't mind. He was used to waiting. On the third day, his patience paid off. A man matching the waitress's description walked into the diner and sat in the same booth Grayson had used. The officer's heart pounded as he watched the man through the window. He didn't know if this was the person he was looking for, but he had to find out. He waited until the man finished his meal and left the diner, then followed him at a distance. The man walked down the street, glancing over his shoulder occasionally, as if he sensed he was being watched. The officer stayed back, careful not to draw attention to himself. Finally, the man turned into an alley and disappeared behind a building. The officer followed, his hand resting on his holster. As he rounded the corner, he saw the man standing there, waiting for him. "Why are you following me?" the man demanded, his voice tense. The officer stepped forward, his badge visible. "I'm looking for Victor Grayson," he said calmly. "Do you know where he is?" The man's eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked like he might run. But then he sighed and shook his head. "I don't know where he is," he said. "But I know someone who might." The officer's heart leapt. "Who?" The man hesitated, then said, "His sister. She lives in the next town over. If anyone knows where he is, it's her." The officer thanked the man and left the alley, his mind racing. He was closer than ever to finding Grayson, and maybe, just maybe, to finding his brother. The officer drove to the next town, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The address the man had given him led to a small, weathered house on the outskirts of town. The yard was overgrown, and the paint on the walls was peeling, but there was a faint light shining through the curtains. Someone was home. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and walked up to the front door. He knocked gently, his heart pounding in his chest. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 50s with tired eyes and graying hair. She looked at him warily, her arms crossed over her chest. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious. The officer introduced himself and showed her his badge. "I'm looking for Victor Grayson," he said. "I was told you might know where he is." The woman's expression hardened. "Victor's my brother," she said. "But I haven't seen him in years. He's not a good man. Whatever he's done, I don't want any part of it." The officer nodded, understanding her reluctance. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said gently. "I'm trying to find my brother. He disappeared years ago, and I think Victor might know something about it." The woman studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. Finally, she sighed and stepped aside. "You'd better come in." The house was small and cluttered, with photos and knickknacks covering every surface. The woman led him to the kitchen and gestured for him to sit at the table. She poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him, her hands wrapped around her mug. "Victor's always been trouble," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "Even as a kid, he was different. He had a mean streak, and he didn't care who he hurt. When he got older, it only got worse. He's been in and out of prison for years." The officer listened carefully, his heart aching for the woman. "Do you know where he is now?" he asked. She shook her head. "No. But there's a place he used to go when he was in trouble, an old cabin in the woods near the state line. If he's anywhere, he's probably there." The officer's pulse quickened. This was it. He thanked the woman and left the house, his mind racing. He knew he had to act quickly. He drove to the state line, following the directions the woman had given him. The road grew narrower and more desolate as he went, until finally he reached a dirt path leading into the woods. He parked his car and continued on foot, the trees closing in around him. After about an hour of walking, he saw it, a small, dilapidated cabin hidden among the trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the faint sound of music drifted through the air. Someone was inside. The officer approached cautiously, his hand resting on his holster. He didn't know what he would find, but he was ready for anything. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding. For a moment, there was silence. Then the door creaked open, revealing a tall man with dark hair and a scar above his eyebrow. It was Victor Grayson. The man's eyes widened in surprise, but he quickly recovered, his expression turning cold. "Who are you?" he demanded. The officer held up his badge. "I'm a police officer," he said. "I'm here to ask you about my brother. He disappeared years ago, and I think you might know something about it." Grayson's face paled, but he didn't say anything. He just stared at the officer, his jaw clenched. The officer stepped closer, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not leaving until I get answers. What happened to my brother?" For a long moment, Grayson didn't respond. Then, finally, he sighed and stepped aside. "You'd better come in." The cabin was dark and cluttered, with old furniture and empty bottles scattered across the floor. Grayson sat down in a chair by the fire, his hands trembling. "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I needed money. I thought if I took him, I could get a ransom. But something went wrong. He got scared, and he ran. I tried to find him, but he was gone." The officer's heart ached, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Where did he go?" he asked. Grayson shook his head. "I don't know. I looked for him, but I couldn't find him. I swear, I didn't mean for it to happen." The officer didn't know if he believed him, but he knew one thing for certain: his brother was out there somewhere. And he wouldn't stop until he found him. He called for backup, and Grayson was taken into custody. As the officer watched him being led away, he felt a mix of emotions: relief, anger, and a deep, unshakable sadness. But he also felt hope. He had kept his promise. He had found the truth. And now, he would keep searching, for his brother, for closure, and for the family he never forgot.